Right, the first unit we're going to be covering in biology series on the scientific method. You've had this one before several other years, but we're going to do a quick review because we do use this the whole year in biology. The three learning targets we're going to be covering are to differentiate between, let me get my pen working here, independent variables and dependent variables, and also the difference between a control group and an experimental group in an experiment, and then what we call constants or controlled variables. Okay, and then our next learning target is to organize and draw conclusions from data found in a table and a graph. Okay, and finally design a controlled experiment with a testable hypothesis. So when we look at the scientific method, it's really just a process for solving problems or answering questions. You may use this in your everyday life just to try to figure out if something, if your car didn't start that morning, you'd start asking questions and making observations and kind of thinking, what's the reason why my car isn't starting? These are the basic steps here, although they can vary from resource to resource, and we don't necessarily use all these steps every single time, but this is the general order and steps that we'll use when we're conducting experiments in biology. The first thing you're going to do is to ask a question or identify a problem. And so we usually call this the problem question of your experiment. And then before you go any further, you're usually going to conduct some background research. Then you form a hypothesis, you conduct an experiment, you collect results, which includes your data, which you're going to have in your tables and graphs. And then you're going to draw conclusions. That's where you analyze your data. And then the final thing that we often don't talk about, and that's to communicate your findings. You're going to do that usually in the form of a lab report. So let's look at these first few parts here. The first one is your question or your problem. So you're going to ask a question or identify a problem. Does fertilizer help bean plants grow taller? That's an example of a problem question. So from there, you're going to conduct that, like I said before, that background research and observations. You're maybe going to read a little bit about bean plants, read a little bit about fertilizer. What does fertilizer contain? How could that possibly help a plant grow taller? So you're going to read this information. You're going to make some observations. So we're going to do a little practice here on writing a problem question. Let's say that a study was conducted to test the effects of playing video games on the heart rate of 10th graders. 20 males and females of the same age were randomly selected to play Call of Duty. I don't know if any of you guys still play this. For 30 minutes. And then 20 males and females of the same age were randomly selected to stare at a blank screen for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, the heart rates of both groups were recorded. So what do you suppose would be a good possible problem question for the experiment above? Well, they're testing the effects of video games on the heart rate of 10th graders. So all we need to do is basically take that statement and change it into a question. How do video games affect, I'm using it as a verb, so I'm using an A here, affect the heart rate of 10th graders. And I just put a question mark at the end. Okay, so all I did was take that statement, switch it into a problem question. So we always want to start each of our lab reports off with a problem question. From there we go to a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable idea based on observation. That's why we always have to do a little bit of that background reading before we actually form a hypothesis for our experiment. We want to have some of that background knowledge. Sometimes we call a hypothesis an educated guess. Well, the reason it was usually referred to as an educated guess It's educated because you have made some of those observations. You've done some reading on your topic. It's a guess because you don't know the outcome yet, okay? That's why you're making this hypothesis. You're kind of making this educated guess on what's going to happen. But it has to be testable, okay? It has to be testable. So we can really break down a hypothesis into two different types, what we call an informal or simple hypothesis. It's just a testable statement predicting the outcome of an experiment. So an example might be fertilizer increases bean plant growth. Okay, very straightforward. It's just a testable statement. I can test to see whether fertilizer increases bean plant growth or not. The next one is what we consider more of a formal hypothesis. And that's where you have this if-then statement. If fertilizer is given to bean plants, then they will grow on average 2 centimeters taller than plants not given fertilizer. So we have the if and the then part of the statement. Now when you're writing these, the if part deals with the independent variable. What you are testing. We'll talk more about these variables later. The then part deals with the dependent variable, what you are measuring. You're predicting the outcome of the experiment. And so we always try to, in our experiments, write an if-then statement for our hypothesis. So let's do a little practice on this. Let's go back to that same example we did. A study was conducted to test the effects of playing video games on the heart rate of 10th graders. 20 males and females of the same age were randomly selected to play Call of Duty for 30 minutes, and 20 males and females of the same age were randomly selected to stare at a blank screen for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, their heart rates were measured and recorded. So an informal hypothesis, again, is just a testable statement. Now, I'm going to say that playing that video game, Call of Duty, is going to increase their heart rate. All right? And they're doing a lot of shooting and all that. I've never played it, but that's what I assume is happening there. So, playing, I'm just going to abbreviate it COD, will increase the heart rate of 10th graders. I'll put for 30 minutes. Playing Call of Duty for 30 minutes will increase the heart rates of 10th graders. Can I measure that? Certainly I can. That's a testable explanation. Now I want to write a formal hypothesis. So I'm going to use an if-then statement. So if 10th graders play AOD for 30 minutes, then they will have a higher heart rate than 10th graders not playing Call of Duty. Okay, I could make this even more specific, which we generally like. Higher heart rate. How much do I think it's going to get higher? Are they going to have 10 beats per minute higher heart rate than those 10th graders not playing Call of Duty? That would be even better because it's much more specific. Okay, so a regular kind of simple hypothesis versus a formal hypothesis. We're going to have more practice